So today's solved case is a doozy. That is the only word I can think to describe the following events. It is a case with a lot of unexpected twists and turns and a lot of tragedy. And it also might be one of the worst miscarriages of justice that I have seen in a case in a really long time. And surely one of the worst to ever happen in Australia. Today we are heading to Perth, Western Australia. And unless I am mistaken, I think it has been a hot minute since I have discussed a case from my hometown. But if you are an older Perth local, then this story might just ring a bell to you. So in Perth, in the year of 1994, lived Pamela Lawrence, her husband Peter, and her two daughters, Katie and Amy. Pamela was a kind and well-liked woman, and she was a business owner. She ran a jewellery store on Glyde Street in the suburb of Mosman Park, called Flora Metallica. So on Monday, May 23, Pamela and another staff member, Jacqueline Barsden, were working at the store with Jacqueline finishing up for the day at around 3 p.m, leaving Pamela to close up by herself. The afternoon soon turned into evening, and on this particular day, a pretty massive storm was rolling into Perth. So when 6 p.m. hit, and Pamela was still not home from work, her husband Peter became pretty concerned. At 6:15, he phoned Flora Metallica, but nobody picked up, so he decided to drive down to the store himself and make sure that everything was okay. He arrived at the jewellery store at around 6:30 p.m, where he was met with a horrific sight. A bloodied scene and his wife, Pamela, barely clinging on to life. He immediately phoned for an ambulance, but unfortunately, Pamela would pass away from her injuries on the way to the hospital. And upon examination of her body, it was determined that Pamela had sustained 12 serious cuts to her scalp and had been viciously beaten over the head with some kind of unidentified object, which led to her passing. Also, tiny flecks of this blue-coloured material were found in Pamela's wounds that couldn't be matched to anything at the crime scene or anything at the jewellery store. It was thought that they must have come from the murder weapon, which hadn't been found at this stage, but we will get back to that detail later. So an investigation immediately begun into this incredibly baffling case. And this case was not only baffling because, well, Pamela was a seemingly very sweet woman without an enemy in the world, but nothing had actually been taken from the jewellery store. Nothing of any real value anyway. Pamela's killer had taken her purse, but it contained very little money, whereas the jewellery store not only had a lot of accessible money, it had, jewellery, expensive, valuable, beautiful, easy to sell on the black market jewellery, and yet not a single diamond was so much as touched. Why would somebody enter a jewellery store of all places, commit an incredibly violent and horrific act, and then take nothing? Investigators did manage to lift multiple fingerprints and one palm print from the crime scene, but the fingerprints were all found to belong to either Flora Metallica employees, police, ambulance officers, or investigators. And the palm print, well, that was a bit of a mystery, but also rather significant evidence, because one of the important employee tasks at Flora Metallica, and I'm guessing most jewellery stores, was to wipe down the glass counter / display cabinet after every single customer to keep it looking, beautiful and shiny for every new person that entered the store. And that palm print was found on the glass counter, so chances are it belonged to the last unidentified person in the store, which was, of course, the killer. Unfortunately, back in 1994, police didn't have any sort of palm print database or any kind of technology to allow them to match the palm print to the perpetrator, so the print was stored into evidence to be examined at a later date. I did also forget to mention that there was one singular witness to the murder, kind of, Possibly, although this person really had no idea what they were witnessing at the time. It was actually the daughter of the staff member that had been working at the jewellery store that day, Jacqueline. Her 13-year-old daughter, Catherine, had actually been getting a lift home with her grandmother when their car stopped at some traffic lights right outside Flora Metallica on Glyde Street at around 5 p.m. When Catherine peered into the store that her mother worked at, she saw this man that she did not recognise standing behind the glass counter where customers were not supposed to be. She described this man to police as being tall, Caucasian, with a ginger beard and wearing a bandana. An identikit sketch was developed based off Catherine's description. I'll put that on the screen now. And from there, police compiled a list of 136 suspects, which were soon whittled down to just one person, 31-year-old Andrew Mallard. So let's backtrack for just a minute. The day before the murder of Pamela Lawrence, Andrew Mallard broke into a home in the suburb of Mosman Park, the same suburb Flora Metallica was located in, and the following day he was arrested for the burglary, charged, and released all before 4 p.m. After his release, he caught a taxi back to a flat that he was temporarily staying at, which was also in Mosman Park, arriving at around 5 p.m, which was verified by the taxi company. His flatmates, however, claim that Andrew did not arrive back to the flat until 6:30 p.m, although they were later labelled as unreliable witnesses. But regardless, Andrew's whereabouts really could not be verified between about 5 p.m. and 6:30 p.m. The only thing that police did know was that Andrew Mallard had been in Mosman Park at the exact same time as the murder and that he had a criminal history. Just one day after the murder, Andrew was once again arrested, this time for impersonating a police officer. And then later that same day, Andrew was admitted to a mental health inpatient facility here in Perth called Greylands Hospital. So before we do get any further into today's story, let's just discuss a little bit about who Andrew Mallard was. He was born on August 16 in 1962 in England to parents Roy and Grace Mallard, and he also had an older sister named Jackie. In 1967, the Mallard family immigrated to Perth, Australia, where they would remain. And growing up, Andrew did have a pretty rough time at school. He was bullied quite a lot and ended up dropping out when he was about 16. After school, he joined the army, but was medically discharged after just 8 months. And following this experience, Andrew really shuffled between jobs, cities, states, and even countries, temporarily returning to the UK before eventually coming back to Perth. And it was during this time Andrew also was smoking quite a bit of marijuana and just going out and partying on the regular. You really could describe Andrew as a bit of a lost soul or a drifter, especially in those early years where he seemed to really be struggling to find his purpose, as honestly many of us do in our 20s and 30s. Unfortunately, by 1994, Andrew was pretty much homeless and going through what he described as a mental breakdown. He had also been in trouble with the law on several occasions by this point, mostly for things like theft or break and enters, but never for anything violent or threatening towards anybody else. So it was on May 24 that Andrew was admitted to the Greylands Hospital, where he was diagnosed with bipolar mood disorder, and it was during this time, during a stay at a mental health facility, that police decided it would be an appropriate time to interview Andrew in regards to the murder of Pamela Lawrence. In fact, they interviewed him on 4 separate occasions during his stay, which was just under 3 weeks long. During these interviews, in which some sources say there was a nurse present, others say there was not, but regardless, I would consider this a completely inappropriate time to interview a murder suspect, whether they are guilty or not. After all, what do the police think they're going to achieve if somebody is not in the right state of mind to be answering very serious questions? And so it is unsurprising that many of Andrew's answers to the police didn't add up, and he struggled to even recall details from the day in question, which doesn't surprise me given that A, he wasn't doing well mentally, and B, if he was not the perpetrator, then the day in question was of no significance to him. I mean, for myself, I can barely recall what I did yesterday, let alone some random day several weeks ago. Andrew also did not have an alibi for the time of the murder, but he did insist to police time and time again that he was innocent. The police, however, did not believe him. And on June 10, Andrew Mallard was released from the Greylands Hospital, and it was just hours later that police brought him down to the police station for an 8-hour unrecorded interview with Detective David Capon, whom also interviewed Andrew at the hospital. So keep David Capon's name in mind because we will circle back to him later. So during this 8-hour unrecorded interview in which police just took notes, they claimed that Andrew confessed to the murder of Pamela Lawrence and even had him sign their notes to confirm this confession. By the way, police are actually no longer allowed to just take notes. To obtain a confession, they need it to be recorded. But in 1994, this was allowed. Strangely, the police actually let Andrew go after this confession, but not for too long. 1 week later, on June 17, police brought Andrew Mallard back down to the police station, this time for a recorded interview. During this questioning, police made a lot of statements in regards to the crime that were rather manipulative in nature. And because Andrew was just trying to be agreeable, he would agree. For example, yes, I agree Pamela's killer did come through the back door of the jewellery store and kill her. It rather reminds me of the scene from Mean Girls, weird example I know, but stay with me, where Regina George says to Katie, "You're like really pretty," and Katie says, "Thanks," and then Regina says to her, "So you agree? You think you're really pretty?" This was kind of the vibe of the interview. In the last 20 or so minutes of this 11-hour interview, Andrew also starts to describe in third person how Pamela Lawrence may have been murdered. I don't know why he does this, but it's a bit strange. He says, quote, "If Pamela Lawrence was locking the store up, maybe she came in through the back way. The front door was already locked. Maybe she left the key in the back door, and that's why he had easy access. And that's why she didn't hear him until he was in the store," end quote. Andrew also described Pamela's killer as evil but scared, and said that he did not want to get caught, adding that the perpetrator attacked her with a wrench, saw the young schoolgirl that unknowingly witnessed this murder, ran out the back door of the store, and then threw the wrench into the ocean. Of course, this is all very specific details. And when the police asked if he was the evil man, Andrew said no. He then proceeded to draw a sketch of this Sid Chrome wrench, the item that they believed was the murder weapon, and also a detail that had not been released to the public. At the end of this interview, Andrew concluded, quote, "Maybe I'm psychic. All those things I told you is what I imagine the killer would have done. I got inside the culprit's head. I got inside the killer's head," end quote. Police took this recorded interview as a confession, and shortly after he was arrested and charged with the murder of Pamela Lawrence. This was despite the fact that Andrew had no history of violence. None of Pamela's blood had been found or even seen on Andrew or any of his belongings, despite the attack being incredibly bloodied in nature. None of his DNA or any trace evidence had ever been found at the crime scene. And of course, at this point, the murder weapon had still not been located. And then, of course, there was the fact that Andrew was interviewed while suffering with some very serious mental health issues, which is very unethical. The trial began on November 5, 1995, where the prosecution's entire argument pretty much rested on Andrew's confessions, because they had approximately zero forensic evidence. The two confessions came from the unrecorded interview with the notes that Andrew had signed and the recorded 11-hour interview in which Andrew describes in third person how Pamela might have been killed. The police also claimed that Andrew had told them a total of 15 things that only the killer would know, including what the murder weapon was, and in fact that wrench drawing that I mentioned before made up a pretty big part of the prosecution's argument. Andrew Mallard did maintain his innocence throughout the entire trial, but in the end he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. And this trial was actually viewed as this massive victory for not only the police, but for the public, who now felt so much safer having this violent killer off the streets. And in fact, the detective I mentioned earlier, David Capon, was praised so highly for his efforts that 2 years later he would be put in charge of the biggest murder investigation to ever happen in Perth, and in fact one of the biggest to ever happen in Australia, the Claremont serial killer case. He ended up leading the Claremont investigation for a total of 2 years between 1995 and 1997, in which he became convinced and convinced everybody else, including the public, that one man and one man only was guilty: Lance Williams. Lance was a bit of a strange fellow, there is no doubt about that, but there was absolutely no solid evidence whatsoever to say that he was a killer. Lance would continue to be stalked and harassed for years by both the police and the public, and have his life basically ruined by being the prime and only suspect in this case. It got to the point where Lance would literally call the police to tell them where he was going on that day if it was out of his usual routine, to save the police the trouble. David Capon would later be accused of having tunnel vision in the Claremont case, and of course, as we now know, Lance Williams was innocent all along, with the actual killer, Bradley Edwards, being arrested back in 2016. Sorry to go on a tangent about the Claremont case, but if you are new around here, that is my favourite true crime case. I've got like 4 videos on my channel about it. It is the biggest case to happen in WA and one of the biggest in Australia. I grew up with it and I refer to it quite a lot on this channel. Anyway, moving on. Oh, and I'm reading a book right now about the case. I'll link it down below, but it was actually this book that reminded me of the Pamela Lawrence and Andrew Mallard case. Moving on. The following year, Andrew Mallard appealed his conviction, but it was dismissed. And over the next several years, despite feeling an incredible sense of despair, Andrew's family formed a team that included the then WA Shadow Attorney General, John Quigley, whom had worked very closely with the WA police in the past and therefore had very valuable inside knowledge and contacts, and investigative journalist Colleen Egan, all who strongly believed in Andrew Mallard's innocence. After some digging and some pushing, John Quigley was able to get a hold of some files that included information that had been purposefully left out of the trial and hidden from Andrew's defense team. It included information about the murder weapon and the fact that police had proof that it had not been a wrench, which was a key piece of evidence that put Andrew behind bars, but back to that in just one moment. And Perhaps the most shocking hidden detail of all was the fact that police had used an undercover police officer named Gary to manipulate Andrew Mallard. So between June 14 and 16, police sent Gary to befriend Andrew, in which time Gary gave him alcohol and marijuana, attempted and failed to extract a confession out of him, and drip-fed him information about Pamela Lawrence's murder that only the killer would know. So when Andrew drew this image of a wrench, this was information that had come from Gary. So armed with this brand new information in June of 2002, now 7 long years since Andrew's conviction, his team brought this case back to the Court of Criminal Appeals, where it was once again dismissed. 3 years later, Andrew Mallard's appeal was finally heard by the High Court, who promptly quashed his conviction and declared a miscarriage of justice before ordering a retrial. The following year, the prosecution dropped the case against Andrew Mallard, in part due to lack of evidence, but also the fact that unrecorded interviews were now inadmissible in court. And finally, on February 20, 2006, after serving 12 long years in prison, Andrew was released. He was, unfortunately, still considered the prime suspect in the Pamela Lawrence murder and was told that if any fresh evidence was to emerge, he could be re-prosecuted. And hearing this was a pretty massive punch in the gut to not only Andrew but his entire family. And unfortunately, because there had been no retrial or any other arrests made, many people did still consider Andrew guilty, including Pamela's family, who were not only devastated but scared upon his release. So the story does definitely not end there. We're now left with the unsolved murder of Pamela Lawrence, which is basically back to square one. And of course, as with any case, the passing of time makes it harder and harder to solve. So thankfully a cold case review was ordered, and this is where they stumble upon the palm print that I mentioned earlier found at the crime scene. Using new technology, the print was ran through a system and it quickly came up with a match to a man that was already sitting in prison, 38-year-old Simon Rochford. And it turned out that Simon Rochford had actually been sitting in prison for about as long as Andrew Mallard had been. And he was there for the 1994 murder of his girlfriend, Brigitte Dickens. I think it might be pronounced Brigitte or Brigitte. I did look it up on Google. I think it's Italian, but I don't want to butcher it and I just sound ridiculous trying to pronounce it as Brigitte. So I'm just going to say Brigitte. So anyway, sorry, you guys know my pronunciations are never great, even though I swear I looked them all up. Just my bloody Aussie accent butchers every single name ever, basically. But of course, no disrespect is ever meant. So in fact, Brigitte had actually been murdered just 7 short weeks after Pamela Lawrence. Back in 1993, Rochford, who was originally from England, had arrived into Australia on a 3-month visa. Upon his arrival, he used a false name and ended up staying in the country well past the visa's expiry. While in Australia, he met Brigitte and they started dating, but after what Rochford described as a stupid argument, he bashed Brigitte to death and hid her body in the boot of her own car, where police found her 3 days later. In November of 1995, Simon Rochford was sentenced to a minimum prison term of 15 years for her murder. So this, of course, doesn't necessarily prove he was Pamela's killer, although the palm print was pretty damning, and it does prove, of course, that he was at the jewellery store that afternoon. So it places him at the crime scene. But when investigators dug a little deeper, they found some actual damning evidence, which was the manner in which both Brigitte and Pamela were killed. Not only did both women have matching bruising and injuries, both in similar shapes and sizes, but they both had the same blue flecks that I mentioned earlier found in their wounds. And this blue material was also found in Simon Rochford's knapsack. It was later discovered that the weapon was actually a steel barbell collar covered in this blue paint attached to a broom handle, a rather strange homemade weapon. And if you're not sure what a barbell collar is, I will pop up a photo on the screen. But it is basically that little metal device that keeps the weights from falling off or sliding off of a loaded barbell. So as it turned out, Pamela was killed with a barbell collar, not a wrench. And in fact, during Pamela's murder investigation, a test had actually been conducted using a wrench on a pig's head, sorry for the graphic detail there, and a report was written up on this test with a pathologist confirming that Pamela could not have been killed with a wrench. Although at the time they didn't actually know what the murder weapon was, probably due to it being so unique in its nature. So police go to speak to Simon Rochford, who at this point is about 4 years away from applying for parole. At this time, police are just having a casual conversation with him and have not officially named him as a person of interest in Pamela's murder. However, several days later, on the evening of May 18, Simon Rochford was watching television in prison when he sees on the news that he has been officially named as a person of interest in the Pamela Lawrence murder investigation. Those working at the prison said that Rochford didn't really seem to react to this news. However, the next morning, when they went to check on him, they found Simon Rochford dead in his prison cell after taking his own life. It's likely that he knew that he would be found guilty of Pamela's murder and did not want to spend another 20 years in prison, so he took the easy way out. And Rochford was actually a suspect in another murder of a German tourist killed in London back in 1993, but no solid evidence was ever found against him in this case. So it's possible that Simon Rochford was a serial killer, and we really don't know how many other victims he could have, which is an incredibly scary thought. This was, however, another devastating blow for the Lawrence family, who never truly saw justice for Pamela. We also never found out why Rochford killed Pamela Lawrence, or what his motive was. Did he planned to steal more from her than her purse, but someone or something scared him away? That is my best guess anyway. But it was a senseless and devastating murder all around regardless. And the worst thing is, or one of the worst things, is that if police had arrested the right man in the first place, Brigitte Dickens may still be alive today, as she was killed just 7 short weeks after Pamela. Upon wrapping up this cold case, it was announced that Andrew Mallard was no longer considered a person of interest in the Pamela Lawrence murder investigation, thus clearing his name finally. And the Lawrence family do also now believe and accept that Andrew Mallard was innocent all along. And as for Andrew Mallard, post all of this devastation and trauma, he did receive an official apology from the police commissioner, and in 2009 he got a $3.25 million settlement from the state government. The Commission of Crime and Corruption also recommended disciplinary action be taken against 2 assistant police commissioners that worked on the Pamela Lawrence case, Mel Sherville and our mate David Capon, as well as the senior DPP lawyer. Both police officers were initially stood down following the recommendation, on full pay, mind you, before they both decided it was best that they just resign to avoid any disciplinary action. However, they did receive full benefits in doing so, so hardly any kind of punishment in my opinion. I mean, yeah, their reputations were ruined, but so what? So was Andrew Mallard's, and he did nothing wrong. It honestly makes me so bloody mad that pretty much everybody involved in this shoddy and corrupt murder investigation just got away with it. And honestly makes me wonder how many other innocent people sat in prison or may still be sitting in prison today. Not to mention that Andrew was probably considered an easy target due to his mental health issues, making it easy for them to pin the murder on him, wrap up the investigation, put a little bow on it, throw an innocent man in prison, and then come away from it looking like the heroes. Honestly, sickening. As you can imagine, Andrew Mallard did suffer from PTSD following his experiences, for which he did receive psychotherapy, but even after his name was cleared, some people did still consider him guilty and treated him as such. As for the money he received, as you can imagine, it never truly made up for the trauma that he went through, and for a period he was being rather reckless in his spending, buying fancy items like Aston Martins, which he would later say never really brought him any happiness. He did eventually manage to turn his life around, however, and find the happiness that he was searching for, although he always felt as though he was chasing those lost years and never truly recovered from his experiences. He would eventually go on to complete a fine arts degree, and in 2010 he moved back to London to complete his master's and also to escape the notoriety that he had here in Perth. He did eventually meet a woman who lived in Los Angeles, and the pair fell in love. Finally, the one thing that Andrew had truly been searching for, his soulmate, his other half. And he had found her, and the couple was soon engaged. During their relationship, there was a lot of back and forth commuting, as Andrew was still London based and she was LA based. And it was on one of these trips to Los Angeles on Thursday, April 18, 2019 at 1:30 in the morning, as Andrew was crossing Sunset Boulevard, he was struck down by a car in a hit and run. A bystander did attempt to give Andrew CPR, but he soon passed away at the scene, aged just 56 years old. A week later, the man who hit Andrew surrendered himself to the police. He was 20-year-old Christopher Smith. Smith was eventually sentenced to 30 days of weekend detention in jail, 30 hours of community service, and a 3-year probation. So, an incredibly sad case of a man, a lost soul, who was taken advantage of with a tragic ending. And then there is, of course, Pamela Lawrence, who never really got the justice that she deserved. And of course, Brigitte Dickens, who should have still been alive today. But I do want to thank you all for being here and listening to today's story. And until next time, stay vigilant and stay safe.